Hello everybody and welcome to this Theme 4 revision video. This video is about what we call international economics, and it's the first big topic in Theme 4. Now on the slide here you'll see the theory that we're going to be covering in this video, but also future videos. This video will cover 4.1.1 Globalization and 4.1.2 Specialization and Trade. Right, so let's think first of all about what globalization actually is. All it is, it's about the increased economic integration between countries. So it's about those boundaries between different countries across the world becoming more blurred. So it means that economies are increasingly becoming more interdependent or reliant on each other to meet their wants and needs. Now you've got then the characteristics of globalization. This is what we see because of globalization. We've got an increased trade as a proportion of GDP, so that means that we have a growth in importing and exporting taking place. So that means increasingly jobs in the UK are dependent on exporting goods and services across the world. So lots of the jobs in London based around finance, etc., rely on exporting them products across the world. But then also we import things into the country, which means that foreign jobs are dependent often on selling output to UK households. So if you look at the Spanish tourist industry, for example, it relies on millions of UK tourists travelling over there and demanding Spanish goods and services. The next two I'm going to lump together: foreign direct investment and multinational corporations, so FDI and MNCs. Now an MNC, or a multinational company, is a large global business. So we're looking here at businesses that base production in at least 2 different countries across the world. So we could be looking here at some of the biggest brands that you probably would all recognize: Nike, Apple, McDonald's, Disney, Toyota, Ford. They've got production facilities in many different countries across the world. Now, a big link to this, though, as well, is something we call takeovers and mergers. Now, a takeover is where a larger firm, normally a large firm anyway, will take over a smaller firm. We also have mergers where 2 large companies across the world might decide to pull their assets together and create one larger company. So what you tend to find is that we create global brands often through takeovers and mergers. So some of the biggest firms across the world might join their assets together. So a good example in the UK is Cadbury's Chocolate, were for years an independent UK chocolate brand, but they were taken over by Kraft from America, and they've recently been taken over by Mondelez, who are a Brazilian multinational company. So you've got all that big investment into the UK economy from that Mondelez company. We've also lost lots of the big brands from the UK, so the UK car industry. So it used to be controlled by companies such as Rover and Mini, Land Rover, etc. Well, most of those firms have been taken over by foreign companies. Now, another link to this, though, is something we call foreign direct investment. And this is where firms or governments or people from across the world invest heavily into each other's economies. And that could be to tap into new markets in different countries. It could simply be to generate profits from investments overseas. So again, that leads to that increased interdependence and integration of the global economy. Another characteristic of globalization, though, is about the movement of people. So increasingly, people from poorer economies might move into richer economies, and that could be to access higher incomes, access better living standards. They may then send remittances back home to family and friends in their home country. It could be people moving to different countries for different quality of life or different living standards. So we have that increased immigration and emigration of people across the world. And that often means that populations within economies become more and more multicultural, multi-ethnic, and become a more global economy in many ways. We also have increased interdependence between nations. So we have global governments that often work together on things such as immigration, on the theme of terrorism at the moment in terms of supporting each other with COVID-19. Economies also work together due to environmental problems, trade restrictions, etc. So economies increasingly work together to try and solve increasingly global problems. The final thing I've put down is increased global supply chains. So you've only got to think about the production of a simple, humble tennis ball. So for the Wimbledon tennis tournament, that tennis ball that is used will rely on imports of resources from up to 30 or 40 different countries coming together to produce that simple tennis ball. Right, okay, now what are the causes of globalization? Well, I've put down here a reduction in transport costs. You've got here a photograph in the top right-hand corner of a container ship. Well, these things can carry a large volume of goods across the world at ridiculously low costs. Now, because transport costs have fallen, it allows us to export more across the world. Because ultimately, if you can export things across the world at a fraction of the cost, it becomes more cost effective to import from different countries across the world. Now, to facilitate this, though, we've also had an improvement in transport infrastructure. Now, we're not just talking about the boats that have got bigger and more efficient at shipping things across the world, but you've got to think then about how do you get these things into your country. Well, you've got a massive improvement in port facilities, and then road and rail to transport these things around countries. And again, this drops the cost of transporting things larger distances, which again makes it more cost effective to make things in different countries across the world. Now, the next one is a reduction in the cost of communicating, but also improvements in how we communicate with each other. But because businesses have become increasingly global, to support that, they need to be able to communicate with staff, suppliers in different countries across the world. Well, we can now do this very, very cheaply, but also we can do it more effectively as well through things such as Microsoft Teams, Zoom calls, the internet, etc. They all facilitate that improved communication of people across the world. And that now means that people can do business thousands of miles apart from each other, but still, effectively communicate with each other to facilitate that exchange of goods and services. We've also benefited from something we call trade liberalization. So this idea that economies are increasingly open to the idea of globalization and remove barriers such as tariffs and quotas and other restrictions that make trade easier to complete. We're also finding that more economies across the world are more open to multinational companies and foreign direct investment. And again, that supports improved globalization. Now, linked to that one as well, China has opened up to a certain extent. They're allowing more trade to take place. So China, remember, is over 1 billion people, so roughly a seventh of the global population. Well, if they open themselves up to the world, that is, again, more trade, more investment that can take place between China and the rest of the world. The Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. It used to be called the Iron Curtain. Nothing went in, nothing went out, really. They were more or less a self-reliant economy. Well, as they've collapsed and opened up to the world, again, that allows for more trade investment to take place. We've also had the growth of trading blocs. So the European Union, for example, they members. They promote the movement of people between members as well. And that promotes more trade and more globalization, at least on a regional level. NAFTA is another example I've put down there, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement or Association. And this is Canada, America and Mexico increasingly opening up their trade with each other. And that promotes globalization between those countries. You then tend to find that trading blocs will then work together to promote trade between trading blocs. So you might, for example, have deals between the EU and NAFTA, which promotes more trade and more globalization between North America and Europe. We've also got the growth of multinational corporations. So increasingly firms are moving globally to access cheaper global supply chains, access new customers in different countries across the world. And that happens often when MNCs are looking to not only lower costs, but also their domestic market might become saturated. So if there's no further growth opportunities at home, these firms will increasingly invest overseas to fuel more growth in the business. And then finally, increased levels of financial flow. So the idea that not only are firms investing in each other, they're lending from each other. So some countries borrow money from each other as well. And again, that facilitates that increased globalization. So what globalization is, it kind of brings economies closer together and more reliant on each other. Right, just to pause now then, what I would like you to do, please, is to jot down these 3 different questions here. So based on what you've seen, what do you think globalization is? Write down 3 characteristics of globalization and causes of globalization. So if you can hit pause, write down your answers. Once you've put down your answers, hit play, please. Right, now you've got here lots of different impacts of globalization. There are lots of big benefits of it, but there are drawbacks of it as well. Now, I'm going to ignore that word comparative advantage because we'll be looking at that in a few moments or so. For me, though, one of the biggest benefits of globalization is it promotes specialization. So not only do we have individuals and firms and regions that specialize production, we now have whole economies that specialize production. So some economies will simply export tea or coffee or other commodities. Other economies specialize in the production of high-tech goods or financial services. Now, this specialization means that economies are producing things that they can produce more effectively than other countries. And then the idea is that we can then import specialized equipment and goods and services from across the world. And that leads to cheaper production costs. It also means that increasingly global firms are competing more against each other. And that leads to firms finding new ways of reducing prices. So we as consumers should benefit in terms of better quality goods, cheaper goods, and over time, increasingly improvements in goods and services as well. In effect, you're buying them from the best country in the world at the lowest possible price. So that should lead to a massive growth in consumer surplus. Now, what it also does, it takes away power from domestic firms. So, for example, if you've got one firm in an economy which dominates a particular market, a car market, etc., well, it now means that that firm is now facing competition from other countries across the world. And that should again lead to more efficiency creeping in as firms increasingly have to compete on a global scale. So that should again lead to lower prices, lower production costs, more efficiency, and better quality products for consumers. I've also put down the word here, monopsony. So a monopoly is where you have a sole seller of a good or a service. A monopsony is a sole buyer of a good or a service. So say, for example, you're a farmer. It could be that your business could only sell to one company in your country. But if you can now sell your output globally, it means you've got more buyers for your goods and services, which could mean that firms can now maybe get higher prices for their products in other countries across the world, which will help those firms succeed better. Now, the next one, if you attract lots of foreign direct investment and multinational firms in your economy, it will significantly increase the tax base. What it would mean is that you've got more foreign firms creating jobs in your country, producing output in your economy, and that will therefore allow your government to generate more tax revenue, so more corporate taxes, more income taxes, more VAT, and that could help the government's fiscal position. The next one, increased production leads to more economies of scale. Now, economies of scale is something we cover in theme 3, but the idea is that if you're producing if you're selling to more customers across the world, your production increases, and that increasingly allows you to produce output at lower prices. So, in other words, the average cost of producing output will increase if you can, will fall, if you can increasingly sell to a global customer base. And again, that should lead to more efficiency and cheaper prices for consumers. You also get a technology transfer. So when you attract big foreign firms into your economy, well, those foreign firms will bring with them not just money, but the latest machinery, the latest technology. And that could therefore act as a big supply side improvement to your economy. The bottom one is the final one I'll pick up on in terms of benefits, remittances. So for poor or developing economies, if they can send their labour overseas where they can earn more money, then a proportion of this can be sent back to their family and friends back home. And that allows those people to earn foreign currency. So for example, if someone from Bangladesh went to work in the UK, they can send pounds back to Bangladesh. Their family and friends can then use them pounds to buy imported products from the UK, which will hopefully improve their living standards. Drawbacks. It's the idea of becoming over-reliant on countries. So if you're specialised in production in one industry, you're then relying on other countries across the world to make other goods and services that your economy needs. Now, this can often make you import dependent. So, for example, the UK relies on the importation of most of its oil, its gas, etc. So that means that without them resources, our economy would collapse. And we rely on importing those from a small number of nations, and that could lead to a bigger trade deficit, which leads to a big withdrawal of money from your economy. We also have a problem of deindustrialization. So in the UK, for example, we've had the steel industry collapse, we've had mining industries collapse, other manufacturing industries collapse in our economy, and that is because it's become cheaper and more productive to make these products overseas. And that means that the people that specialise in these industries become structurally unemployed. They lack the skills to transfer into new growth industries. So that could lead to more inequality, more poverty creeping into an economy. Linked to that, though, as well, you have this increased competition between workers across the world. So firms might threaten to pull the plug and base production somewhere else. And that can lead to lower wage rates in some industries for people across the world. Next one is tax avoidance. So when you attract big foreign firms into your economy, they're very good at hiding output, and they can often hide output in countries across the world where tax rules are a lot less severe or tax rates are far lower. And that means that large multinational firms might operate in your economy, but they might not pay a lot of tax in your country. You're also going to get a worsening of the environment. So the idea would be that because you've got more importing and exporting taking place, you've got the environmental costs associated with moving products across the world. So that contributes towards more global warming. You've also got the problems of weak regulations in developing economies. So increasingly firms base production in economies that don't necessarily protect their environment to the same standards that we do in rich countries. So if big manufacturers increasingly base production in poor countries, it means that you're going to get a big explosion in environmental problems in those economies, which will then create a large global impact. Now, on that theme as well, workers in developing economies might become exploited. So big MNCs might base production in Bangladesh because workers are not only cheap, but there's weak laws around employment protection. So then workers might get exploited by those large firms. We can also get the growth of global monopolies. So the idea would be that as firms grow and expand across the world, they can become large dominant players and then exploit not just workers, but consumers, not just at a country level, but on a global scale. For many economies, they also suffer from something called brain drain. So this could be where workers move from your economy to other economies where they could earn more money. But that means that your workers would be benefiting other countries, and it means that your economy has reduced its productive capacity. They can no longer access those skills within their economy. Now, clearly, those workers moving into rich countries, though, would benefit richer countries. It means the richer countries can access their skills and fill skill gaps and labour shortages within their own economy. Economies also, though, another drawback, become vulnerable to external shocks. So, for example, when you think about the global financial crisis, it originated in America, but because the UK have got lots of investments in America and Americans got investments in the UK, and the UK relies on trade to a certain extent with America, problems in America quickly spread to the UK economy. So when you're more hooked into the global economy, you're also more hooked in to the problems that might happen in those countries as well. You also lead to a loss of cultural independence, or what we call standardization. Many people call this Mac world. So when you get the big development of global brands, you lose local culture. So we're all familiar with McDonald's, which in effect is an American company, and their ideas and philosophies take over UK culture. So my son, for example, now relies on watching lots of American movies and things on YouTube, and is becoming more American. And that is a problem that's happening across the world. It's a loss of cultural identity. Right, what we'd now like to do, please, put down these questions, A, B, and C. Write down your answers. So hit pause, please. Once you put down your answers, please hit play. Right, well, we're now going to be thinking about one aspect of globalization, and this is about international trade. Now, it was Adam Smith that theorized something called absolute advantage. And this would be the idea that countries should specialize production on output they can produce cheaper than other countries across the world. So in other words, you can produce a good using less resources than other countries across the world. Now you've got here some different production possibility frontiers. So we've got country A, which is the red line, and what we're assuming here, by the way, is that both countries have got equal access to factors of production. But in country A, with their resources, if they were to use all their resources to produce flowers, they could produce 100. If all resources went towards finance, they could make 50. Country B can make 100 financial services or 50 cut flowers. Now, the idea would be then that if country A was to produce financial services, they could only access 50. And if country B was to make flowers, they could only access 50 flowers. Now, the idea would be that the economies, rather than trying to produce both outputs in their economy, they should specialize in what they've got the advantage at the production of. Now, what this would do, it would lead to an improvement in living standards in both countries. And this can be shown by the trading possibility curve. So country A would now specialize 100% in making cut flowers. Country B would 100% specialize in the production of financial services. Now, this would therefore mean that country B could now technically trade 100 financial services to access 100 flowers. If they were based production solely within their economy, they could only access 50 flowers. Country A, when they were self-sufficient, could only access 50 financial services, well, they could now technically trade 100 cut flowers to access 100 financial services. Now, what you can see is the trading possibility curve is further out than both of the individual production possibility frontiers. So it shows through trade and specialization and interdependence, it means that the people within these economies could now access more output than what they could do before. Okay, so absolute advantage, countries will 100% specialize production on what they can produce more efficiently than other countries, and then use that output to trade other output with other economies across the world. Now, this is a bit of a numerical example taken a little bit further. Now, what I've done now, I've assumed originally that both economies are independent. They don't trade with each other at all, and they both decide to base production 50% of their resources towards financial services and 50% towards cut flowers. Now, country A, look at what they could do before. If all their resources went towards flowers, they could produce 100. If all resources went to financial services, they could produce 50. Country B, it was 100 financial services or 50 cut flowers. So if both countries allocated 50% of their resources towards both products, country A would be able to make 25 financial services and 50 flowers. Country B would make 50 financial services and 25 cut flowers. And that means if you add up the global production across these two countries, there is 75 financial services and 75 cut flowers. But at the moment, we've got no specialisation and no trade taking place. Now, if these economies could agree to specialise, then what could happen? Country A would allocate all resources towards flower production, and country B would allocate all resources towards financial services production. And look what happens. The production of finance grows from 75 to 100, flowers from 75 up to 100. There's therefore been an increase in the production of both goods and services. That therefore means that the countries can have access better living standards through trade. So A would make solely flowers and therefore rely on trade with B to access financial services. B would rely on trade of financial services to access flowers from country A. And you can hopefully see the interdependence that now takes place between these countries. They rely on the other economy to access the other good or service. Right, what I would now like to do, please, is to hit pause and jot down your answers to these 3 different questions, please. Once you put down your answers, if you can hit play, and we'll move on to something a little bit different. Right, now here's a problem. Absolute advantage. Well, it was an economist called David Ricardo who said, well, hang on, if trade is based on absolute advantage, how come we have countries that are efficient in the production of lots of different goods and services buying things from other economies who are less efficient? Now, the idea here is that it was based on Britain in the 19th century. Britain had absolute advantage in the production of loads and loads of different things, but they still bought some of them products from different countries across the world, and it made no sense. Now, he therefore said it doesn't mean that trade is wrong, it's based on different reasons, and he came up with a theory of comparative advantage. So rather than producing what you can do more efficient than another economy, what we're looking at now is an economy will produce what they can produce at a lower opportunity cost than another country. Okay, so another country might not be efficient at making it compared to you, but they are sacrificing less of another good to make another good or service. So in my house, for example, I'm better at cooking and cleaning than my daughter. So I've got absolute advantage in the production of both. It doesn't mean there's no work for her to do. So the idea would be I could still allocate to a job of cleaning a bit of the house, because that would free me up to do more skilled work across my house. Okay, so it's about giving work to lower skilled economies. It frees you up to do more productive things instead. So for example, in Britain, if we were to produce more toys, we might have to sacrifice some really high skilled financial services. So by getting another economy to make toys for us, it frees up our resources to make higher skilled, more productive financial services. Now, there are some assumptions we've got to make, though. We assume there were no economies or diseconomies of scale. So as we change production, there's no impact on average cost of production. We assume no transport costs, so it doesn't cost anything to move things across the world. We have no barriers to trade, so no tariffs, no quotas. We have perfect mobility of factors of production, which means if we were to move production from one good to another, those workers that move across are equally skilled at the other unit of output. They work producing something else. And we also ignore the environmental and other externalities which are impacting on the economy because of international trade. Okay, so when we look at this model of comparative advantage, we've made some huge assumptions. Right, now you've got here a worked example of comparative advantage. Now, if you look at the PPF, what we can see then is 2 economies, and again, I'm assuming they've both got roughly equal size factors of production, more or less anyway. Now, country A has got the absolute advantage in the production of both. With their resources, they can produce way more financial services and flowers than country B. So what you would argue is based on this, well, country A has got no benefit from trading with country B. It can produce both finance and flowers more efficiently using less resources than what country B can. But this isn't right. Now, to do this, we've got to be looking at the opportunity cost. So, for example, country A, for every cut flower they produce, they sacrifice 2 flowers. Sorry, every cut flower they sacrifice, or they produce, they will sacrifice 2 financial services. So look at that. Cut flowers 50, finance is 100. So for every cut flower they make, they are sacrificing double the amount of financial services. For every flower country A makes, they sacrifice only 0.5 cut flowers. Country B, for every cut flower they make, they sacrifice 1 financial service. Or for every financial service they make, they sacrifice 1 cut flower. Right, so we've now got to be using the theory of comparative advantage to work out what countries should now do. Now look at the top. We've got here again the idea that these countries are not specialising and they're not trading with each other. If country A was to allocate half of its resources towards making finance it could make 50. If the other half resources went towards flour production, they could make 25. If country B split its resources 50-50, then they would make 20 financial services and 20 cut flours. So the total production between the countries is 70 finance and 45 cut flours. Right, what we're now going to assume then is that country A is going to move resources more towards financial services. So it will shift some of its resources away from flour production towards finance. Country B is going to completely specialise in flours production. Now look what B can do first of all. If they move all their resources away from finance towards flours, they can produce on their own 40 flours. Now in country A, if they shift their resources mainly towards financial services, 80% of their resources in fact, they can produce 80 financial services. Now they could produce 100, but by sacrificing those 20 additional financial services, they can still produce 10 flours. Now look at the impact on global production then. Country A has got the comparative advantage of the production of finance. B has got the comparative advantage of cut flours. Global production will increase of both goods. So services and financial services will grow from 70 to 80. Flour production will grow from 45 to 50. So look why A's got the comparative advantage in financial services. When A produces finance, they only sacrifice half a cut flour compared to one cut flour in country B. So what you would argue is A is far better off focusing on financial services and then importing flours from country B. Country B has got the comparative advantage in flour production, and look why. Country A will sacrifice 2 finance when they produce a cut flour. Country B will only sacrifice 1 financial service. So by specialising based on the theory of comparative advantage, living standards in both economies should improve. Right, would you now put down the answers for these questions, please? So question 3, A, B, C and D. Hit pause, write down your answers, please. Right, last thing now. It's about the benefits and drawbacks of specialisation and trade. Well, look at the advantages first of all. What we know is through the theories of both absolute and comparative advantage that when countries specialise and trade with each other, there is an increase in global output. Well, that means that there's better living standards available because people can access a bigger level of goods and services. Further to that, if countries are producing what they can more efficiently or what they can produce at a lower opportunity cost, that should lead to lower prices. Countries can increasingly import more variety and better products from across the world to give consumers more choice. That will, of course, create more competition as well, which could lead to further reductions in prices. Trade also allows for the transfer of technology. You can buy in better capital, better machinery, better infrastructure, better consumer goods through importing and doing it domestically. Obviously, economies of scale. If you were to produce to a global market rather than a smaller domestic market, that can lead to cheaper costs. And that again can lead to lower prices for consumers. Firms can access bigger markets. So if you're a firm and you can only sell your goods domestically, your market is capped. If you can increasingly sell them products internationally, you've got a bigger market for your business, which means you can grow, you can make more profit, employ more people, which again will raise welfare. It also means that we've got more efficiency. You know, rather than producing things that you're inefficient at, you make what you're best at doing and you then export those goods to access things from other countries that you're not very efficient at making. So clearly there are some big advantages of trade. Drawbacks of it though, what happens if you lack absolute and comparative advantages? Well, if you're inefficient at making most goods and services, it means that you technically will import all those things into your economy. Well, that would lead to the prevention of industries growing. It could lead to more deindustrialization, and that could create unemployment and inequality problems. Now, the next one is something that we call dumping. Some economies, China mainly here, don't play fairly. They will often dump because they've been given large subsidies from their government, products in global markets at very, very low prices. And that would lead to domestic firms closing down. This happened with steel production, where Chinese steel producers have literally dumped ridiculous quantities of cheap steel on European markets. And that has meant that European steelmakers have struggled to compete and have been forced to close down. Lots of African farmers complain about this from America as well. The Americans dump very cheap agricultural products, so food, in Africa, and that means that domestic farmers can't compete and they close down. You've also got the risk of external shocks. So increasingly, if you're relying on exporting and importing, well, problems in one country can create ripple effects and therefore create problems in your country. So, for example, a few years ago, there was a tsunami that swept through Japan. And that meant that European car manufacturers that relied on importing engine components from Japan couldn't access what they needed. And that ground production to a halt in our economy. Also, it means that if you're relying on exporting certain products across the world, if those economies fall into recession, your export markets might dry up. If other governments start changing their political policies, it might mean it becomes more difficult for you to access your imports. And that, again, could grind your economy to a halt. You tend to get unequal growth as well. So only industries in your economy where you have absolute and comparative advantage will grow. So in the UK, for example, we've lacked these advantages in the production of steel, textiles, etc. And those industries have declined, whereas financial services is a big strength for the UK economy. And then those things will grow. And that has led to the north-south divide in the UK. So the southeast of England is very successful because they've got advantages in production of financial services. That region grows. The north of England has suffered from deindustrialisation because things we used to produce we now import. And it means that those regions suffer economically. And that leads to growing relative poverty in different regions across the country. We also have something called the infant industry argument. Now, the idea is here that new small firms might struggle to set up and compete against large international firms. So the idea would be that because you've got intense global competition, it might be quite difficult to get an industry off the ground. So that could prevent the growth of new industries within an economy if it's cheaper to import as well. And that might prevent the economy from diversifying into new different goods and services. Now, another problem is something we call monopsony power. Now, the idea is here that it's a problem mainly for developing economies. When they export their agricultural products, commodities across the world, there's often very, very few buyers across the world. And that often means those big global buyers from richer economies can exploit these people, give them very, very low prices, which can prevent those economies from developing and improving their living standards. Right, guys, this is the last question. So question 4, based on what you've seen, what do you believe are the 3 biggest benefits of trade? What do you think are the 3 biggest drawbacks? And then finally, do you think trade is beneficial for a country? Please justify your answer. Right, thank you very much. That's the end of this video.